Hey everybody, Jeremy Bourne with GrayMatter here. I want to welcome next Rick Peters, CISO of Operational Technology at Fortinet to GrayMatter's Wastewater Cyber Summit. Rick, good to have you here.
Hey, it's always a pleasure. Thanks, Jeremy, for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kick things off today, can you give us a little bit of background about your role at Fortinet and your experience working in cybersecurity with water utilities and other types of critical infrastructure out there?
Sure, it's a pleasure. With Fortinet, it's been about 3.5 years now on the commercial side, and I say that, and I'll defend that in a minute. And it's really been a focus on working across operational technology. You hear a lot of terms thrown about today with respect to critical infrastructure, and certainly the utilities, water, wastewater has gathered and gained notoriety, unfortunately, right, through some cases that we've seen have illustrated the propensity of adversaries to pick those as targets, primary targets, successfully, even worse, right? And in my 3.5 years, I've seen us improve and advance tremendously, right, in the solution space. But the pace of innovation and the growth and the dependence, right, on data and that connectivity that comes with that has really increased the attack surface. And so that's made a very challenging job, but one that's been rewarding because I do see growth. I see a lot of partnership in the community, a lot of sharing of intelligence and information, which is in the right direction. And interestingly enough, before I started with Fortinet, I spent just shy of 4 decades on the intelligence side of things, working with the National Security Agency. And there, of course, you kind of work on both sides, depending on where your assignment is. And at times, we're targeting foreign opportunities in the SCADA ICS domain, as well as defending then U.S. critical infrastructure. So you kind of work offense and defense, right? And a lot has happened, though, in the last, I'd say, 5 to 7 to 8 years. That's kind of changed the dynamic and certainly brought a lot of attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we wanted to have this summit, is because we know that water and wastewater utilities are super focused on cybersecurity these days for obvious reasons. The headlines that we keep seeing basically every week, leading off the beginning of this year with Oldsmar. So, since it's so top of mind for water, wastewater professionals, one thing I wanted to ask you about, because we get asked about it a lot, is, what are some of the resources people can look to, if they're looking to fund a project to strengthen their cybersecurity, and just improve support overall for their OT cyber projects?
So if we're just talking in general about sourcing, I would say obviously there's a lot of language out there right now from the current administration, from executive orders to specific national security memoranda, which have been out. In fact, NSMM5 was published, 3 weeks ago? And in that particular memo, actually disclosed water and wastewater as kind of one of the next hurdles, right? There are several beyond the electric system, which they characterize under utilities. It then goes into natural gas. Of course, there's this big surprise, but also water, wastewater, and then even the chemical sector. So those are natural focus areas. And with that, of course, is going to come a resource, right, that's going to be downward directed. And I would say you're going to see that at state and local jurisdictions be demonstrated out. And the languages then get a little hairy, right? You can start looking at things like the American Rescue Plan, which then derives values and ability to get monies to upgrade services. But I think you better be able to show your proof and your case for how you're going to get the return on investment. Demonstrated knowledge of where your gaps are, and then those steps that you're naturally going to take, so someone sees that you've got articulated out a plan that's well conceived. Not just going to chase and hope that we gain the success. And then I think you want to think about it at different tiers. There's the metropolitan area, which typically you're going to get Department of Treasury resource. In fact, was involved here recently in advocating on the commercial side for Treasury funds for water and wastewater. Very, very important. As you get into counties and smaller domains, though, then you're going to get into state funding, right? You're going to get into the FEMAs and the state flows of resource. But I think always it's about showcasing a level of readiness and knowledge, demonstrated expertise or a knowledge of what needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And, what are some of those ways that utilities can get prepared or service providers can get prepared? two or three ways that, if they're looking to secure funding, if they're looking to make that best case that you're talking about for an OT project, what should they be thinking about?
I think what should be top of mind with any utility is start with a focus on readiness. And by that, I mean, a qualified, tested incident response plan, because I think in most cases, it's the lack of that. If you're choosing a cybersecurity framework, that's going to be one of the components that you need to tend to. And illustrated readiness seems to be the language that you're finding a lot in the executive orders and all of the subsequent releases of language that's coming out of the current administration. That shouldn't be a surprise. They're holding the bar higher for critical infrastructure, and it's really a notion of responsibility, accountability, and demonstrated readiness. So I think that's really important. I think it's also important to understand within, if you're trying to gather the momentum from within, that you understand and convey the cost of consequence, right? Failing to achieve the readiness can end up obviously with lives lost, worst case, certainly lost revenue and downtime. Consumer confidence falls fast, right? And regulatory penalties for failure to comply. So there's lots going on in that space. And I think overarching all that, you better have done a gap analysis that illustrates your clear understanding of the return, and then be able to amplify intelligence and case studies that reflect that growth and the attention on this sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of takes me to the next thing that I want to ask you about. So when you're talking with clients, and they're looking to build that leadership level support that I think everybody knows you need to really get any kind of project like this that's going to affect multiple, departments or whatever, what do you do to prioritize, getting the assessment, getting that gap analysis, getting the improvements kind of in front of leadership and through their approval process?
So I part of that, and it goes beyond just the technologies, right? You can get all hung up on the latest and greatest solution, the product, the point solution that might seem to address that one specific issue, but I think you have to think bigger than that. You hear the term ecosystem thrown about considerably, and I think that's the right idea, right? It's the agility, the ability to pivot within the environment, but then beyond that, ensuring that you're employing cybersecurity best practices that are not just well known, but fit into the reference architecture that you're adopting. And then security maturity is really multidiscipline. I mentioned technology, but it certainly involves the maturation of your workforce, your people, pivoting them to be an asset instead of a liability. Recognizing your process engineering, certainly in the water, wastewater area, that is incredibly important. We've already seen that. You mentioned the case already. And then technology, right? But working all three of those avenues that require investment and growth and maturation that then allows you to be in a better state.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that 100%. So what are like a couple of questions, maybe two or three questions, that, it's one of those situations where you don't know what you don't know, right? And how can somebody in a role at a water, wastewater utility who maybe, isn't able to focus 100% of their time on cyber, start to determine their level of readiness? How prepared are they to mitigate a potential cybersecurity incident? What are some, questions or answers they should be able to come up with to gauge that?
Well, you make a great point right out of the gate. Before I answer the question, you point to the fact that there's competition. The investment dollar, right, is always stretched in the competition, particularly over the last year and a half, right? We've gone through so much change and transition with the pandemic-driven changes. That certainly OT didn't get a free pass on that one at all, right? We had to extend how we accomplished business. But I think if you wanted to point to three specific areas that are conspicuous, I'd say start by asking, do you have a comprehensive cybersecurity framework in place, right, to ensure that you have an appropriate solution focus? Because that's going to allow you to achieve and be able to point to your level of readiness and response, because you can test and evaluate that. That's a growth thing that shows maturation. I'd also say, are you confident of your asset visibility? That's a commitment, right, to the extent that we enforce some zero trust, or I just say earned trust, for all your devices, applications, and accounts, because there's a dynamic there today. And water and wastewater is certainly attributed to being connected to more devices that are intelligent and smart and communicating. So my connectivity and my knowledge and my accessing of data in there, which is certainly a big part of what's driving the change, is a focal point. And then the third area or question I would ask is, are we leveraging beyond, say, a containment strategy? Most folks are thinking about segmentation already, but if you've done that, are you leveraging actionable intelligence as a part of a proactive defense in depth strategy? I think that becomes a discriminator, right? Because it says, I'm going to get out in front of this. I'm going to be proactive instead of reactive. That shows up in your framework. That shows up in your continuous trust assessment. And it starts to build confidence, both within and external to the company, so that when someone comes in with a magnifying glass and wants to evaluate and inspect your readiness, you're able to showcase that in a way that shows it as a proof point.
Yeah, and I think that can build confidence with leadership too, because you have all of that information available to them. And you mentioned just really quickly two terms that I think are interesting and get brought up a lot, zero trust and earn trust. And especially earn trust. Could you expand on that a little bit for people who might not be familiar?
I can. It's if you think about credentials, right, and just use the term credential for a minute, it's the ability to assign and insist on earn trust. By that, a device or an application or even an account holder, an employee, has to provide multi-factor authentication, a means to demonstrate that, one, I am who I am, so you can't be masqueraded unless those credentials are lost, obviously.
Right.
But usually that requires something personal. There's a credential process there that says, hey, there's something here about you. Could be a biometric, could be a number of things, right, that allow you to ascertain that indeed it is Jeremy who's accessing the system. And oh, by the way, he's approved to access level 3. He has HMI access and credentials, but it's limited to that. It doesn't give you the freedom to wander from point to point into spaces that are beyond your role. So that containment, that role-based access, and that insistence on earned trust says, you might be maintenance coming in and providing a service. Well, every time you come in and attach to the domain, you once again have to align and evaluate and prove your credentialed access. That allows me to ascertain, one, that you're doing what you're supposed to. And if for some reason you start to demonstrate a behavior I haven't seen before, it provides an alert and a way for me to be proactive in analyzing and determining whether or not I have a rogue activity.
Yeah, and I think that's so much more important nowadays with especially with more remote connections and probably more contractors or temporary employees coming in and out and needing access to the system.
Think supply chain, right? If you're thinking about the number of relationships we must trust outside of the company itself, that gets enormous, into the dozens typically. So that's a lot to manage, right? And so when you think about, I've already got all this complexity and now I've got to manage all these supply relationships, it is complex. And so I need to automate as much of that as I can so that those kinds of services just happen transparently, because I can't slow down the enterprise. We're talking operational technology here. So transparency and scalability are key, and it's got to run fast.
Yeah, and my colleague Scott Christensen is always talking about how availability is super important, in OT, and especially for water, wastewater, where your ratepayers are expecting 24/7 uninterrupted access to their water supply. So.
I'm glad you brought that point up. It's an absolute responsibility in critical infrastructure to remember who we're serving.
Right.
The customers out there, and today they're all connected, are quick to consume intelligence. And we can look at the case studies, whether you're talking about gas, whether you're talking about water and wastewater, and you see the perception of the public shapes the situation very quickly. And the lack of information and communication, which can be a part of your response plan, is inherently a part of how accurately you can portray what's happening and then manage the perception of the public and of, in this particular case, the consumer, right? Because the consumer has the expectations. They want to be able to trust the water they're drinking, the services they're getting, whether it's power, water, and all the management of that infrastructure that supports that. So, I think it's today it's incumbent on the executives and the system owners, the decision makers, to recognize that that is an absolute top line priority.
Well, Rick, I really appreciate you taking time to talk with us today at the summit. And if folks have questions about anything that we talked about today, they can post them in the chat window and we can address them. Rick, I hope we get a chance to sit down and talk in person one of these days soon. I'm sure we will. But this was great. I really appreciate your knowledge here today.
I'll look forward to that, Jeremy.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for being here.
Take care.